Today's big idea. U.S. power has always been more than tanks and tariffs. Keohane and the late Joseph Nye Jr. argued that Washington's edge came from how it combined hard power with interdependence and attraction. In their view, recent U.S. policy leans too hard on coercion. Think headline-grabbing tariff threats and public browbeating of allies, and too little on the soft power trust that makes partners want to work with America. So the core lesson today is counterintuitive. In an interdependent world, deficits can be an advantage, and soft power is strategic power. Countries that export far more than they import are actually vulnerable to U.S. pressure. Meanwhile, when the United States looks attractive, for example, reliable, benevolent, and competent, it needs fewer threats to get its way. Overuse of coercion erodes that attraction and invites others to hedge against U.S. influence. For a bit of a disclaimer, the whole purpose of basically this entire channel is to more or less, gain a better understanding, get different points of views, and it's more of like having like history over opinion. So like this, for example, this is a summary of Keohane, I can't pronounce his name, and Joseph Nye's article, The End of the Long American Century. It's kind of just to get a different point of view, right? So to make this this point, we have 6 different pieces of evidence going into today's core lesson, right? So firstly, the deficit advantage is by the numbers. So in trade relations, the side with the surplus is more exposed. If Washington limits imports and the surplus partner has fewer levers to retaliate. The author's point is that U.S. trade is extremely asymmetric with countries like China, Mexico, and the ASEAN, where the export-import ratio is more than 2-to-1, and it's still clearly asymmetric with Japan, for example, that has an export to import ratio of 1.8-to-1. The EU is 1.6-to-1, and South Korea is 1.4-to-1, where really there's only Canada that's somewhat balanced with a ratio of 1.2-to-1, to where it's almost even. So this asymmetry, can't talk this morning, underwrites U.S. bargaining power if it's used judiciously. Secondly, coercion without attraction backfires. So the essay catalogs how headline coercion, threatening Denmark over Greenland, musing about taking back the Panama Canal, weaponizing broad tariffs, and exiting the Paris Climate Accords and the World Health Organization, signals strength, but it burns trust. So allies comply in the moment, but resentment and doubt push them to reduce long-term exposure to U.S. leverage. That's the opposite of the Cold War empire by invitation kind of theory that kept NATO durable. Thirdly, soft power still matters, and the public sees it. So the authors note that before the latest round of coercive policy, China lagged far behind the United States in global public opinion. For example, in a Pew survey in 2023, across 24 countries, it showed as much. So attraction reduces the need for carrots and sticks. Bullying raises the so-called transaction costs of leadership itself. The fourth point is globalization has net strengthened U.S. power. Yes, trade and technology shocks disrupt communities, but over the last 75 years, the churn of Schumpeter's creative destruction has boosted American innovation and spillovers, and world trade has grown about 4,400% from 1950 to 2023, and blanket assaults on globalization hit the parts that help the United States and miss the parts that hurt. Fifth, interdependence cuts both ways, so use it smartly. China can exploit U.S. vulnerabilities by pressuring iconic firms, for example, Apple and Boeing, or politically sensitive sectors, and by restricting inputs like rare minerals. The point isn't to decouple from everything. It's to understand mutual exposure and avoid self-inflicted wounds that make retaliation easier. Sixth and finally, the strategy test ahead. So after the Cold War, the United States basked in a favorable moment and let the old order run on inertia. Today's landscape of new tech, rising powers, and shaken trust won't let a future president lead the way past presidents did, unless Washington crafts a post-primacy strategy that blends hard power, smart economies, and renewed soft power credibility. So in conclusion, to be clear, Keohane and Nye aren't eulogizing American power. They're warning about how it's used. The United States still sits atop extraordinary strengths, a huge market, deep alliances, innovative capacity, and the world's most attractive brand when it behaves like a trustworthy leader. The risk is thinking brute pressure alone can carry the day. The play is the play is one that worked before. Combine leverage with legitimacy and treat interdependence as a source of power, not a weakness to rail against. And if any of this resonates with you, or maybe it didn't, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. And remember, the main purpose of these is to spark the discussion and gain a deeper understanding of our world in and of itself. For a little bit of a bio on the authors, so Robert O., I'm pronouncing it Keohane. Maybe that's not how you say it, but that's what makes sense to me. So he's a professor emeritus of international affairs at Princeton and associate at Harvard Center of International Affairs. And then Joseph Nye Jr. was a University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard's JFK School of Government and served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Director of the National Intelligence Council in the Clinton administration. And they have a few books, for example, A Life in the American Century, and then seems like both of them wrote Power and Interdependence, World Politics in Transition together. So with that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.